Good evening. Before we get into the proceedings proper of the Ewen Green Memorial Lecture, which my colleague Nick Stargard will introduce, there's another bit of business to do, which in addition to the Memorial Lecture being endowed by, in memory of Ewen, there was also a prize endowed which recognises his huge commitment to teaching, in that it's awarded to the Magdalen history student who achieves the kind of highest mark in finals for a thesis each year, showing the role Ewen played in encouraging generations of students to kind of engage in research at a serious level. So before we go to the lecture, what I'd like to do is just present the prize to the student in question, Agatha Peppers, who, let me say a little about what she did. It wasn't on 20th century history. It was on the work, the theology and philosophical work of Robert Kilwardby, who sort of vaguely sort of entered on my radar as an oddball first Dominican to become an Archbishop of Canterbury. These rare occasions when an Archbishop is plucked from the intellectual world of Oxford in 1272. I think he survived as Archbishop for 6 years before being whizzed off to become a cardinal and dying within a year of doing that. But his only political act, I think, was crowning Edward I and Eleanor. But for the most part, as Archbishop, as he was before, he struggled and worked continually on trying to reconcile Augustinian sort of patristic work with Aristotelian classical thought. And Agatha's thesis was a sort of wonderful sort of exploration of how this had panned out in terms of perceptions of memory and his sort of thinking about different takes of classical memory and patristic memory and how he steered between these two, trying to bring them together. So a beautiful bit of work, and I'm very glad, and I know Ewen would be too, that Agatha is now continuing that at a master's level with the benefit of the Clarendon Scholarship. So, Agatha, come and receive your prize.
Thank you. Well, it's an enormous pleasure to be able to introduce Hester Barron to you. Many of you, I'm sure, know her from when she was in Oxford. When I came to Oxford in 1999, she was already well ensconced, as only second-year undergraduates can be, and knew everything about Magdalen already and had a seat as a violinist in the University Chamber Orchestra. And seats in the University Chamber Orchestra are very hard to come by because nobody ever gives them up. And Hester continued to come back to Oxford after her undergraduate degree, after having written her doctorate, while she was still in London. And I think it was only finally, when the commute from Brighton became too much, that another seat in the violin section became available. Hester was taught by Ewen and worked very closely with him, and she also did her doctorate with Josie Harris, who would have liked to be here this evening. And she wrote her doctorate on something I thought would be a terrible fashion victim subject, namely social class. To write this in the early 2000s seemed courageous. Now it seems blindingly obvious, again, that we should be talking about social class. And in doing so, Hester chose a topic which is also about family history, namely the Durham miners community, which is the world her father left to become an artist, that her grandfather inhabited as a coal miner. And she rethought how social class worked during the Great Lockout of 1926 in terms of community, in terms of family, in terms of gender conflicts, and in terms of inequality, as well as the struggle for social solidarity. And that book came out in 2009, and she then returned to things she'd been talking about doing, which were more directly about the family and about childhood and children as historical subjects. And that's what she's really been working on ever since, with the sort of centering around the role of education. She and Claudia Siebrecht brought out a wonderful edited volume in 2017, Parenting and the State in Britain and Europe, 1870 to 1950. And last year, she and Claire Langhammer published The Class of 37, Voices from Working Class Girlhood, in which girls who wrote directly for mass observation speak in their own voices, which is quite rare for a whole cohort. And it is a wonderful read, and I do recommend it. This is a conventional thing in German scholars. So German scholars always do one volume which is readable, and the other volume is all the notes. So this is the academic volume that then has come out this summer. But being Hester is not unreadable in the form of a German apparat, where the footnotes are like 90% of the page and they're 2 lines of text. And this is called The World of the School, Education and Community in Interwar London. And that is what I hope we're going to hear a little bit more about now. So Hester, you're very, very welcome.
So, thank you to everyone for coming. It feels very odd and more than a little bit nerve-wracking to be standing here with old Oxford friends and acquaintances and tutors in the audience. And this auditorium actually opened when I was a second-year undergraduate here, when Nick arrived at Magdalen. And I used to come here for film nights organised by the JCR. I didn't really ever imagine that I'd be standing here at the front giving a lecture. But obviously that was all such a long time ago. And I got a shock when I was preparing this lecture, and I realised that I'm only 5 years off now the age that Ewen was when he died. And in my memory that he can't have been that young, because he was so wise, so erudite, so sharp as a historian. In many ways, I didn't share the same historical interests as Ewen, or at least we didn't if you just look at our publications. So when I was a fresher, I remember being in the room with him when he described himself to a classmate as being an intellectual historian, a historian of ideas. And I remember being really embarrassed because I just had no idea what he meant by that. But his interests were wide-ranging, and I remember a few years later his outrage because somebody had questioned his suitability to act as my supervisor for my PhD research, because he didn't work on labour history, and as Nick said, my PhD research was on the 1926 miners' strike. And I remember him scoffing, and he said, I haven't published on it, but I do read. Of course, in the end, it was his illness rather than his intellect, which meant that he couldn't really engage in my supervision. And I'll always be grateful to Josie Harris for taking over. But I suppose the point is that Ewen was interested in everything. He saw the connections between everything, the importance of the big picture, and for him, nothing should be siloed. And so I hope that he would therefore have approved of what I've been trying to do with my latest project, which is to try and integrate the history of education with the concerns of wider British social history. And so to do that today, I want to talk about the book that I published in the summer, The Social World of the School, about elementary education in interwar London. So the history of education often feels particularly siloed. And I mean, it literally is in some universities because of a departmental separation between historians of education and historians. And the history of education has also had to fight a reputation within the discipline Not a particularly deserved reputation, I think, anymore, but nevertheless a reputation for kind of dry, dusty, policy-based history that's not particularly innovative. For whatever reason, social historians of modern Britain don't generally pay much attention to education. So if we look at the interwar years, for example, there's been a lot of brilliant work recently looking at issues of community and identity and looking in really nuanced ways at the complexities of class and gender and ethnicity. But many histories of this period pay very little attention to children's experiences or the social history of schooling. Peter Mandler's recent book on education after 1945 makes the same point when he talks about how the best social, economic, cultural, gender histories of the period too often, so in his words, relegate education to an afterthought. But I want to argue that actually the school is an essential lens through which to view the social history of interwar Britain. For two reasons. The first is that by 1918, education mattered more than ever in ordinary people's lives. Exceptions to the compulsory school leaving age had been abolished that year, and so all children between the ages of 5 and 14 were now experiencing a standardised, receiving a standardised experience of education. And so for many, schooling, or at least a son or daughter's experience of schooling, was a constant of everyday life. And schools mattered in all sorts of different ways. So they acted as sites of welfare, they prepared children for their future lives, they helped to develop ideas about class and nation and gender, and also because of the many and varied interactions that they had with the local community. And so what happened inside schools obviously affected children, and of course that in itself is a reason to study them, because children's experiences are no less important than any other social group, but they also affected the wider working class communities around them. The second reason why I think we should pay attention to schools is because these educational experiences weren't just background noise, and they could be drivers of significant social change. So the usual narrative privileges the Second World War as being the kind of transformative moment that changed public perceptions of the possible. But I'd like to argue that it's actually this period that sees the genesis of attitudes and ideas that are more often associated with the period of the welfare state, and that we can see that happening through schools. Because, of course, the interwar period was a particular democratic moment. Expectations of state institutions had changed after the First World War. The relationship between citizens and government had been altered by war service. The extension of the franchise offered new, democratic, egalitarian concepts of citizenship and social inclusion. Then you've got technological changes, the politics of consumption that were changing aspirations and expectations. And that applies to London possibly more than anywhere else in the country. And schools became an important place, therefore, where parents, for example, could exercise an increased power as ratepayers or voters, consumers. And of course, the children in them are the generation who are going to be growing up to vote for change in 1945. I have to admit that I didn't start out knowing that that's what I was going to do with this book, and I've been living in the world of London elementary schools for many years now, so I was pregnant when I first started doing the research, and my son is now in his last year of primary school. So it's been in development for a long time. And I did other things in between. I published 2 other books in between. But as with any project that sits with you for such a long time, my ideas changed quite radically between the beginning and the end. So when I began the project, I was planning to write a fairly straightforward lived experience of the classroom. And quite early on, when I was doing lots of kind of very broad preliminary reading around the topic, I came across a key work of educational sociology written by the American Willard Waller in 1932. And he was looking at the psychology of teachers and teaching in 1930s Midwest America. And in the preface of his book, he says that what this book tells us, so he's talking about his book, what this book tells us is what every teacher knows, that the world of school is a social world. Those human beings who live together in the school, though deeply severed in one sense, nevertheless spin a tangled web of interrelationships. That web and the people in it make up the social world of the school. It is not a wide world, but for those who know it, it is a world compact with meaning. It is a unique world. It is the purpose of this book to explore it. So at the point at which I read that, and so we're probably going back to 2012 or so, that passage really encapsulated what I thought I was doing as well. So I wanted to chart the lived experience of the classroom, and I saw its everyday interactions, so that tangled web of interrelationships, as being at the heart of my research. Waller, of course, was looking at American schools. I was concentrating on London elementary schools, and these were the state schools that the vast majority of children went to from the age of 5 to 14, at which point they left at school leaving age. A minority of children, so we're talking maybe 15%, might win a scholarship at the age of 11 to go to a secondary school, or they might pay to go to a secondary school because secondary schools charged fees. They were more academic, they were more prestigious, but I was just looking at the elementary schools. My most important source base was school logbooks, which were kept by the head teachers of every school, and thousands of which are in the London Metropolitan Archives. Some teachers wrote a few entries a year and gave the very, very barest of details, but others are writing 2 or 3 entries a week and packed them with information about what has happened in the school on any particular day. And they're incredibly time-consuming sources to use because the evidence is so fragmented and diffuse, but they can be hugely rewarding. And the evidence that you collect there can be beautiful in its kind of ability to conjure up particular moments of classroom life. And so back to reconstructing that classroom life and back to Waller. So when I came across that quotation, I decided there and then that I was going to start my book with it. And 10 years later, I did still start the book with it. And in fact, the title of the book, of course, is in homage to it. But now my ideas around it have changed. So as I did the research, I realised that the social world of the school was much wider than that particular passage allowed. So the tangled web of interrelationships in my book isn't just about the internal relationships of the school, but stretches outwards to include families and the wider local community and economy. Chronologically as well, its focus moves out to think about past scholars as well as the future voters, parents, workers that pupils are going to become. And so my book became a story of the social relationships that shaped interwar Britain. So there aren't just teachers and pupils in my book, but there are parents and neighbours, school managers, inspectors, medics, welfare workers, clerics, local businesses, and local government officials. The point is that any story about schools shouldn't just be about what happens within the 4 classroom walls. I suppose the other thing that influenced that thinking wasn't just the length of time that I was working on the project, but also the context in which I wrote it. So most of the actual writing of the book was done during lockdowns. And of course that was a strange time to be writing anything. I mean, it was a strange time, full stop. But to be writing a book that reflected on schools and schooling felt particularly odd. I mean, at the time, I was measuring a successful day by whether or not we could keep homeschooling going by beyond about 11 o'clock in the morning. And of course, during that time as well, schools, or the absence of schools, were constantly in the news. So by the 3rd lockdown, the government was belatedly saying that the best place for children to be was in school. But in 2020, pubs and Primarks opened before most schools opened. You had Marcus Rashford's campaign to extend free school meals. There were concerns about the invisibility of vulnerable children if they weren't in school. There was a lot of concern ongoing about children's mental and physical health. And there were other things that kept making me think of parallels with the interwar period. I read a note that had been entered in a school logbook in 1922 that a headmistress was absent from school owing to nervous exhaustion. And I read it and wondered how on earth her counterparts, pretty much a century later, could possibly be coping. A few months ago in July, I caught a discussion on the Today programme about the rising cost of living and the problem that families were facing given the upcoming summer holidays. And one of the interviewees was from a charitable foundation that ran a summer holiday for kids. And he said, "What we've learned through the pandemic is this. Before the pandemic, I think people would have answered the question, what are schools for, with, well, they're about learning, maths, history, science, etc. But I think we all now know that they play this huge anchor function in every community. They work with children and parents, become counsellors, support for parents in their relationships, in their housing and their finance, etc. But that question of what are schools for was very present during the pandemic, as debates raged about how and when to reopen. And writing it during lockdowns, it was kind of a question that was constantly in my head, and I ended up organising the chapters of the books around that question. But that Today interviewee talked about schools as having a huge anchor function in the community, but I'd suggest that that anchor function was just as present in the interwar period as well. And in fact, in 1934, the teacher's periodical, the London Teacher, says something very similar. That there have been great changes which have taken place within 1 or 2 generations in our ideas about the functions and the purpose of the school. The idea that a school is merely a place of instruction, where the appliances are pens, paper, ink, books and slates, has gone forever. So in the rest of the time I've got for this lecture, I want to explore one aspect of that in more detail by thinking about the way in which elementary schools were embedded into local communities through their relationship with parents. In both contemporary discussion and historiography, the elementary school has often been represented as very different to home and street. An inherent tension between school, which is seen as a proxy for the state, and home, which is a proxy for the community. And there were ways in which that sense of separation increased during the interwar period. So hierarchies were reinforced by the professionalisation of education and child welfare more generally. Schools were becoming sites for the collection of medical data and psychometric testing. And educators and experts now had a scientific and medicalised language to assert authority over parents. The enhanced status of the teaching profession, better pay, better training, meant that teachers were also more likely to be distanced from their pupils, both in terms of class makeup, so tended to come more from the lower middle class now, and also age, because they were older when they started teaching, compared to the pupil teachers of a generation earlier. And in official circles, it's not surprising, maybe, that the school environment was usually valued over that of home and street. Inspection reports of schools in this period are generally pretty condemnatory of the homes from which children came. They might be described as neglectful at worst, uncultured and uninspiring at best. One inspector congratulated a headmistress, for example, on her school's particularly good performance, and he thought it was particularly impressive, given that she had to work with what he called the somewhat lethargic material that comes in from the surrounding neighbourhood. And in fact, the school might be idealised as a place that conformed more closely to a kind of middle-class vision of home than the houses that their working-class pupils came from. So another inspector praised the school for performing what he called many of the functions of an ideal home in an area where home life is hardly possible. So that ideological separation of home and school was frequently accompanied by an expectation of hostility and sometimes physical confrontation. A common trope of childhood memoir is the school child cringing as their parent arrived at school. So one memoirist, born in Stepney in 1926, recalled, "I'd see her burst into the classroom, 5 feet tall and 4 feet across, shouting, 'Where's that master who hit my boy? I want to see the headmaster.' She always came up to school, even though we always tried to keep it from her or beg her not to come. Even though she promised she wouldn't, she always did." Every year there were successful prosecutions of parents for physical assault. Sometimes the violence was really serious. There was an instance where a female teacher was rendered unconscious. In another, a headmaster had to take 3 weeks off while he recovered. And of course, the vast majority of less serious instances never made it to court. And you read the school logbooks of the period and you come across dozens and dozens of instances of the physical and or verbal abuse of teachers by mothers or fathers. And it's interesting, incidentally, that the gender of the parent doesn't seem to matter here. But disputes between parents and teachers didn't mean that hostility was irreconcilable. And many disputes weren't solved by the stereotypical response of a parent storming into school and assaulting a teacher. Dissent might be voiced through letters, not just to the head teacher, sometimes direct to the London education officer. And several that survive are courteous, articulate, and impressively restrained in some instances. So this is one from a father whose son attended a school in Poplar. And he writes to the education officer, "It's with regret that I have to write to you on such a matter, but my son returned home from school with his nose swollen and several wheals on the back of his neck caused by his teacher punching him. I realise and understand that a boy must be checked, but I do protest against violence of this kind." Other parents asked for clarification of the rules, and there's a collection of letters in the archive that have been collected about to the education officer related to the wearing of jewellery. One parent was upset that her daughter had been made to take off her ring in class, and she wrote that if council regulations state that children must not wear jewellery, I readily submit and will see that she doesn't wear it again. If they don't, she will continue to wear it until I tell her to take it off. And that sentiment is echoed by another mother who complained about a similar incident. She writes, "If it was in the council rules, I would abide by them." And a third parent makes an explicit reference, or more explicit reference, to the power relationships between home and school. And I looked this particular parent up on the census. In 1911, he's down as a general labourer. In 1936, he wrote to the education officer to explain. that I do not like to cause trouble, but I appeal to you that it is your duty to inform this woman, the head teacher, of the provision of the Education Acts, that she is a paid employee of the ratepayers to educate their children and not to make silly regulations that tend to make the children's life a misery. Now, that reminder that parents paid the wages of teachers derived maybe from a sense of entitlement that was encouraged by the newly democratic context of interwar Britain. Those kind of overt declarations are rare in the sources, but parents were kind of assuming a certain degree of power just by writing the letters in the first place. And that authority was also encouraged by the fact that sometimes they did change things, they did make things happen. In at least one instance, a teacher's contract was terminated following an inquiry initiated by a parent. Admittedly, the balance of the power unquestionably lay with the school, and that was rare, but there were other ways of resolving grievances which might kind of satisfy parents that their complaints had been heard. So a head teacher might quietly move children between classes, or in a small number of cases a child might be moved to a neighbouring school. Sometimes just an apology was enough. And many concerns raised by parents were acknowledged as reasonable. So one winter, for example, an infants head teacher made sure to remind her staff that the children needed to make sure that the children put their coats on before break, because there'd been several complaints by parents that the children were being sent out straight out of the classroom into the wintry playground. Some complaints had a moral force. One memoirist remembers being mocked by a teacher following an absence to care for her sick grandmother, and her father wrote a letter to the school, and she writes, "Nobody was sarcastic to me again." Now, of course, the angry parent who went to the school, punched a teacher, or wrote to the education officer, obviously occupies a bigger presence in the sources for obvious reasons, and much harder to find are those, or much less visible, are those hundreds, thousands of parents who never had, or at least never acted on, any grievances. But many had a more positive role with their children's teachers. Parents could play a significant role in school life. So mothers might make costumes for school plays, send in fruit or flowers for harvest festivals. Fathers might help decorate a school hall or attend to a school garden. Some parents might offer expertise. So you've got instances of fathers returning from abroad, for example, and talking to the children about their travels. Or another parent who works for or has access to a printing press who prints the school songbooks. Many logbooks record resources like lantern slides or gramophone records or sporting equipment purchased either out of funds raised by parents or donated by individual mothers or fathers. And increasingly schools encourage that kind of involvement. An increasing number of elementary schools in this period initiated open days. So one headmaster recorded in his logbook that the object of this was to see the school, meet the boys' teachers, and obtain cooperation and promote understanding of parents. And parents attended these events in their hundreds. I came across a Lewisham school, for example, and the inspection report for this particular school said that it was an area with high unemployment. It said that many families were suffering. It said that children were often delicate, delicate being a euphemism for malnourished, basically. And inspectors at this school yet recorded that attendances of parents at school functions was so large as to be embarrassing. 300 parents attended the Nativity play, for example, in 1932, and it only had 336 children on the roll. More generally, the attendance of fathers as well as mothers was sometimes explicitly recorded. and schools tried to encourage that often by holding Saturday or evening sessions. Schools might reach out in other ways as well, so via a school magazine or via newsletters. One head credited newsletters as being a valuable link between the school and the parents. Parental interest could be strong even in the most deprived areas. There's a school called Bath Street School in Finsbury, and it was described by inspectors as being situated in one of the worst slum areas in London, their words. But in 1934, the school sent home 318 individual reports to pupils, and 307 were returned with a parent's signature to the headmaster's gratification. That kind of participation in school events was all the more impressive in poorer areas as well, of course, given that it was more likely that mothers were going to be casually employed. There's a school in Bethnal Green, and again, using the inspection report to see the social economic conditions, the inspection report noted that it catered for about 370 children, and it described them as being drawn from a population living largely in a state of poverty, constant unemployment, and unsatisfactory housing conditions. But it also said that teachers were devoted to the school, and so are the children and their parents. And the school held its first ever open day in 1923. It didn't have a hall, so it had to use a nearby church. 150 parents attended. In 1928, it experimented with another event, and it invited parents of one particular class to tea, and 30 women attended, and the headmaster wrote that they were waited upon by their own children. The afternoon was a complete success. Each child had brought a cup and saucer for his own mother and was responsible for her comfort. Now, obviously those initiatives didn't take place everywhere. A substantial number of schools lacked the space or the facilities or the enthusiasm to host events regularly, if at all. Some failed to attract parental interest. As late as 1938, inspectors were critical of a school in Rotherhithe. The parents of the school, which it called them apathetic, but it hoped that the newly formed Parents Association and other new initiatives like open days and concerts and so on might change that. And sometimes, of course, it was the teachers who lacked enthusiasm. So after organising a successful social for 200 parents in 1927, one headmaster grumbled into his logbook, and he underlined it for emphasis, that unfortunately no member of the staff of boys, girls or infants attended. But when they did take place, school events were credited with reducing potential friction. And the impression, if you read hundreds of these inspection reports, the impression gained is that relationships with parents were positive much more often than not. It's harder to get direct impressions from parents, but sometimes you can see that their support for particular schools actually means that friction and tension is a result of their support. So in 1925, the decision was made to convert a junior and infant school in Wandsworth into a secondary school, and there was anger and upset amongst parents, hundreds of whom signed a petition to say that they didn't want to send their children anywhere else. In 1929, there was another dispute in Bethnal Green over a school's closure and the reallocation of its pupils, and again, nearly 100 parents signed a petition in opposition, arguing that the school was the most convenient for their children and by far the happiest school, although both petitions, incidentally, were unsuccessful. In 1937, there was yet another school reorganisation, this time in Lambeth, but again causing discontent. An inspector wrote, in this region, the parents are strongly attached to the schools. Perhaps the finest testimony to the general good work done by the school is shown in the respect of parents, who find it not merely something to make use of, but something to be proud of. It is, in a singular way, our school. Individual teachers, as well, often inspired affection and gratitude. In 1936, there was an school was on a school trip and it invited parents to go along to visit. And afterwards, 2 sets of parents happily wrote to the headmaster, "We should like to bring to your notice how much we appreciate the care which is being taken by the 2 masters in charge of the boys. The boys have every confidence in the masters and obey their word of command and do not fear them. We feel sure this also prevails at school, and the boys could not wish for 2 better masters, who have made every effort to teach the boys good comradeship and self-reliance." Another little sign of good relations is the fact that in May 1926, when the general strike meant that travel was difficult, reports on the London district noted that several dozen teachers made arrangements to sleep locally, and in several cases with the parents of children. Ties might be particularly strong in those parts of London that registered little mobility amongst its population. And lines of continuity forged by generations of a single family attending the same school were noted by several inspectors. And the school could therefore become a reference point across decades. And the result can be seen on occasions like Armistice Day, when events might become a rallying point for the community beyond its immediate pupils. Another inspector commented of an East End school that many of its children had parents and grandparents who'd attended before them, and he suggested that there's a strong local attachment to the school due not merely to tradition, but to the influence acquired by the past and present headmistresses and by the assistants, many of whom have been on the staff for many years. And memoirs also comment on the respect and the affection fostered, albeit with different language. So one memoirist remembers, "The headmaster of the boys was the same man as when Dad was a boy. He was now able to clump another generation over the knuckles with his long ruler. Old boys like Dad were very fond of him and always pleased to have a word with him when their paths crossed." In any case, there wasn't necessarily a strict boundary between those who made up the school hierarchy and the communities who attended the schools. So teachers, of course, were part of the local community as well. It's not unusual to find examples of elementary school teachers whose sons or daughters went to elementary school. And teachers themselves, of course, had once been pupils, often London elementary school pupils, sometimes at the very same school at which they were now teaching. I was a teacher at an Islington school who had been a scholar at that school on the day it opened. The school closed in 1931 and he was a teacher there on the day it closed. There was a headmaster of a Catholic school in Fulham who wasn't only an ex-pupil, but he was also the son of the previous headmaster. And that kind of overlap of identities was recalled decades later by a woman who had been a pupil at a London elementary school, and she remembered her school hall, and she remembered the wooden boards that hung on the hall walls, and she said the huge wooden board had the names of scholarship winners from the year dot on it, and how we giggled because we actually knew the Christian name of one of our teachers, for she had been a former pupil. Now, none of that is to suggest that the social divisions between teacher and parent were entirely removed. In 1938, one headmaster received a letter from a satisfied parent, and he presumably was pleased with his letter, he copied it into his logbook. And he wrote, "On Tuesday afternoon, as sick, George was leaving, he slipped down the school stair and has sick, sprained his ankle, sick. He was brought home by 2 of your class. I thank them very much, sick, for doing so, as it was quite an accident and no one to blame." And of course that letter is really clear evidence of the positive relationships between home and school, but the headmaster's addition as he's writing out this letter of the 6 remains a kind of small, semi-private reminder of his superior status. But teachers still tried to be responsive to parents' needs. In July 1919, a teacher dismissed her girls' department early because it was the peace celebrations the next day, shops were going to be closed, and she knew that mothers would want their daughters home early to do the chores. Pragmatic consideration of home life meant there were kind of shufflings of the school day to better fit with the lunchtime shifts of local factories or to coordinate with other school departments attended by siblings. In January 1924, many schools altered their lunch hour because of the railway strike. The strike ended midweek, and many schools decided to keep the changed lunch hour until the end of the week, deliberately or explicitly, so that mothers would get notice of the change of lunchtime. And individual teachers might also demonstrate a keen awareness of the pressures that families might be under. In 1936, the education officer conducted an inquiry into the certification of what were then called, in inverted commas, mentally deficient children, to try and ascertain why these children were being assessed late and therefore not being placed in what was deemed more appropriate education. And one head replied to his inquiry, "I frequently discussed this child, but I did not submit her name to the school doctor. The mother was attending hospital with her heart and was ordered to bed to rest for long spells. The girl was a great help and spared her much exertion. The husband told me the doctor had warned him she was liable to fall dead at any time. I knew I was probably doing wrong, but the child was getting patient individual help in the elementary school, and by being so near home could be useful to the mother." Although eventually she did have to present the child for examination, and the child did get sent to a special school which was much further away. Many inspection reports of schools in poorer areas noted the role of the head teacher, and particularly the headmistress, as someone who mothers could turn to for advice, and spoke about the kind of domestic, educational, personal advice that head teachers could give. And various head teachers noted the considerable time that kind of role took up. In 1927, there was a committee of East End headmistresses who were lobbying for more generous staffing, basically more supply teachers. And the reason they wanted it, they said, was because a large part of the head teacher's time is devoted to giving parents friendly advice on the most varied problems, and visits from parents in these areas cannot be confined to regular times, as a rigid ruling as to time discourages the parent from seeking such advice. And the point being that where the head teacher therefore had to look after a classroom because of lack of staff meant that valuable social work becomes impossible. And again, evidence from parents suggests that at least some of them appreciated the effort. "Dear Sir," writes one, "I'm writing to thank you very much indeed for the way you were good enough to look after my son George. I'm pleased to say he seems a bit better, but he has a very bad cold. Sir, as regards his milk, please do not think we do not try with him. I take 1 pint of milk a day. I get tired of trying, so perhaps you would see he has it at school. I will give him his penny. Once again, thanking you very much." And the letter, of course, it both shows his appreciation of school, but also that kind of sense that they're working together as a team as well. Now, obviously, the individual personalities of teachers and parents mattered. No doubt some disputes were caused by personal dislike as much as structural hierarchies. There was a head teacher who diagnosed one child as suffering from inefficient, irritating and irritable parents. But attitudes were also variable, so a brief conflict didn't necessarily determine relations for a child's entire school life. In 1921, a head teacher recorded that a mother had been abusive in hall, she'd instructed her son to defy the teachers, and generally been very unpleasant. And then several pages of the logbook later, which kind of equates to about 2 years, the same head teacher wrote of the same mother, or of the same boy, that he'd been in a playground accident, and he writes, head teacher provided first aid, later the mother visited and thanked the teachers. And the head teacher probably didn't even notice the kind of contrast in entries 2 years apart, but obviously both remain valid as testament to parental attitudes. So hopefully all this is to kind of show that, yes, the space defined by the school remained different to home and street in significant ways. The educational hierarchy always implicitly, often explicitly, placed greater value on the former. While parents didn't necessarily see themselves as unequal partners, but they had their own expectations, even demands, regarding children's education. But hopefully, this has shown that rather than kind of a state of kind of constant mutual enmity or hostility with which they're sometimes portrayed, the relationship between parent and teacher, between home and school, was fluid, was dynamic, could be constructive as well as confrontational, but most importantly that relationship existed with kind of give and take on both sides. So to start, to wrap up, I said at the beginning that a thread running through my thinking on this topic was that question of what schools were for. In the interwar years, a common reason given for why schools should be valued, what they were for, was their civilising function. And that language of civilising was explicitly used by educationalists who saw schools as a way to develop morality and behaviour and citizenship in working class children, and to offset what they saw as the usually detrimental effect of working class parents. And even the imposing architecture of the old Victorian schools with their red bricks, large windows, gable ends, made it easy for commentators to characterise them as alien to working class communities and thus representative of a different set of values. There's a quote from a Sherlock Holmes short story, which some of you might recognise because I'm certainly not the first historian to use it. But Holmes and Watson are they're above London, they're on a train viaduct and they're looking down on the city. And Holmes says, look at those big isolated clumps of buildings rising up above the slates like brick islands in a lead-coloured sea. And Watson says, the board schools. Holmes says, lighthouses, my boy, beacons of the future, capsules with hundreds of little bright seeds in each, out of which will spring the wise, better England of the future. That rhetoric was born out of anxieties stemming from industrialisation and urbanisation of Victorian Britain, and it remained inherent to the rationale of interwar schooling as well. So as an inspector wrote in 1933 of a school situated in a deprived part of North London, he wrote how it was a little centre of civilising influence in the locality. Now, I obviously don't want to deny that tensions existed between formal educational institutions and kind of children, parents and other local interests, and they clearly did in interwar London as elsewhere. But that question of what schools were for requires a consideration of the local community, because the point is it wasn't always the school that got to decide. So the view offered by educational officials and inspectors might be modified by teachers who had a more pragmatic sense of their district. Parents might have alternative ideas about how school could be useful. Children had their own thoughts, which might change as they got older and was different for boys and girls. Local industrial firms wanted good workers, Local mistresses wanted good servants. Politicians wanted good citizens. And expanded welfare possibilities, responsibilities, and new progressive pedagogies also meant that at least some of London's schools could reflect a sense of possibility and could raise aspirations rather than contain them, even if practice was often restricted by economic reality. And so rather than seeing schools as state impositions on working class communities then, I suggest that they were much more likely to be grounded in those local communities. And maybe that was particularly the case in London, where the noise of traffic or industry was rarely absent from outside classroom windows. In 1929, a head teacher reminded his staff that the subjects that they set children for writing exercises should be ones that were familiar to the children. And he told them that suitable subjects for London boys are hoardings, trams, buses, barges, the Thames, postmen, policemen, cinema, etc. And you just read the words and you hear the bustle going on outside. And so in contrast to the imagery offered by Sherlock Holmes then, I want to finish with the words of a memoirist that I came across who's writing about her school days in the east of London in the 1930s. And she's describing her school playground, which is on the roof, which was very common in London because space. And she writes, "I must tell you that our playground was on the roof. This was true. We chased up the stairways to be on top. There were railings all around, and we could gaze down and see rows of houses, church steeples, factory chimneys, the gasworks, and even where I lived, wondering what there was for dinner." And I love that quote because it inverts the Sherlock Holmes imagery. So rather than seeing formal educational institutions as kind of impositions that were enforced on communities and sought to shape and mould them in a particular direction, here it's the child who's looking down, and the school is an organic part of her community. And so I'll end with that. To use a phrase that Ewen would have used, I've been burbling away for long enough. So I'll finish. Thank you for listening.